Good morning. It's awesome to be with you all today. As Althea mentioned, we just don't know what goes on from moment to moment, so it's good that we stay close with God every moment. The last time I was here 2 weeks ago, we looked at this meal that turns out Jesus was at a meal. We could talk a little bit more about some of the details there. And it was at the house of Simon the leper, and this is where Mary, the former prostitute, had she showed herself to want to give her heart to God. Today, the next story that comes about is the story of the Last Supper, Passover meal. 2 meals, back to back. And when something happens like that, you can't help but compare and contrast the two. And so that's kind of where we're headed today. The stories are told in Matthew 26. And the story we looked at a couple weeks ago, Simon was a Pharisee, but it says that he was a leper, meaning he was not an active leper. He wouldn't be able to be out among other people if he was. The only one that was healing lepers at that time was Jesus. And so now Jesus is at his house, and we saw that Simon showed Jesus absolutely no kindness. He showed him no respect, no courtesy, nothing from a generous point of view. We also saw in that story that the disciples of Jesus who were there, they acted selfishly also in response to Mary pouring out her perfume on Jesus. We saw that Mary was treated in a contemptible manner by Simon and his Pharisee friends that were there. If Jesus knew what type of woman she was, well, he wouldn't even associate with her. Everything about that meal was wrong except for what Mary did in the way she responded to Jesus. The next meal, the Passover meal, what we call oftentimes the Last Supper, was not a great meal either, as Judas at this meal will show himself to continue the selfish behavior that he had at Simon's house. Judas had made the decision to betray Jesus. He does this, we're told, for 30 pieces or 30 coins, 30 pieces of silver. And I try to represent that on that photo today, that graphic today. But we're going to see that his motivation was not money. His motivation for rejecting Jesus was because Jesus put forth and highlighted his example of servantship for mankind. And we will see this today. The contrast between the two stories, Mary in one and Judas in the other, the contrast could not be greater. One is a betrayer, the other one, Mary, she would have been, in her own sense, a betrayer, but she became faithful to Jesus. And we saw this because she took that perfume, which was a concentration of her wealth, and she poured it out on Jesus. She poured it out onto his feet, according to Matthew. Mary was a broken human being, but she found peace in the presence of Jesus. Judas is proud, but instead of finding peace with Jesus, he's irritated with Jesus. Mary wants to serve Jesus and grow his kingdom. Judas wants the kingdom not because of service, but he likes the idea of power. And we shall see that. In preparation for the Passover meal, Jesus told his disciples exactly what to do, where to go, set the meal up in a specified location. And that meal, the Passover meal, was to be a time of joy and peace because it represented God's protection of his people coming out of the land of Egypt. But this particular meal was filled with stress. They knew, all the disciples knew, that the Jewish leaders were looking for Jesus. They knew his life was in danger. Jesus himself had said that they would crucify him when they got a hold of him. Once that meal started, the tension level even went up further because of something that Jesus said directly to his disciples. He said in Matthew 26, verse 20, he said, or the story says, "Now when evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12 disciples." Then verse 21, he says this, "And as they were eating, he said, 'Truly, I say to you that one of you will betray me.'" Well, that kind of raised the tension level in the meal. The countdown to Calvary is on. Jesus is going to die on the cross within a few hours. A pivotal moment has been reached here. Jesus' ministry for the crowds of people is done. He has now decided to spend the remaining hours he has with his disciples, to spend his time with this team that he has put together. To put it in another way, he's going to spend this time with this new family of God, which has grown up. These guys that Jesus is eating with, he has given them his best. He has given them devotion, sacrifice, love. They have lived together. They have talked together for over 3 years. Jesus has made big promises to them. And they in turn have made promises back, commitments. It should be a time when they are tight and strong together. But Jesus says, no, one of you is going to turn on me, betray me. The remaining hours are going to be tough. The one member of the team, Judas, as we know, turns on Christ. Judas has a problem, and that problem is with Jesus. The Apostle John gives us some insight to what was going on at this meal that Matthew does not give us. We should not be surprised by this because John slows the speed of the story down. He'll take the last night and tell us in 5 chapters what Matthew, Luke, and Mark will tell us in a couple paragraphs. So he gives us extra details. what was happening between Jesus and Judas. I want to look at some of this as John gives it to us. In John chapter 13, verse 2, it says, during the supper, the devil, having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him. So, just like Matthew says, there's going to be a betrayal. We learn here it's the devil putting this in his heart. And this isn't new information in John's gospel. John had actually prepared his readers, and the disciples knew about this. Back in chapter 6, Jesus had said this, "Did I myself not choose you, the 12, and yet one of you is the devil?" Verse 71, now he meant Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, for he, one of the 12, was going to betray him. So it was not new information, but the time had come. This word betrayal is an interesting word. In the Greek language, it is from the word, the base root of the word is to give. But betrayal is more than something giving to another person, because in the Greek it says that the Greek word has the idea of a prefix in front that gives the idea of a relationship. So betrayal is not just, okay, I'm going to do something or take something from you. It assumes trust, which means that it's really bad. In other words, where there is no trust or love, there cannot be betrayal. That's the point I'm trying to get to. Betrayal assumes a relationship of trust and love. And that's what Jesus had with Judas. Thus, in this story, at the moment that we learn that Jesus is now going to care for his disciples, he's going to love his own, it says, at that moment, John adds the commentary about Judas's betrayal. So we learn that a member of his family will betray him. And it's so interesting. You read the stories through the Gospels, and you think that the enemies of Jesus are the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, the priests. But the real problem comes from inside the house, so to speak. And it gets worse. Verse 3 and 4 of John 13 tells us this. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God, got up from the supper and laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself. This is how I mean it got worse. Because we're seeing here how Jesus is going to love his disciples. He's going to do so by washing their feet. That may seem like a really weird way to love someone, but it is the act of service. It is agape. It is service. We learn in that verse 3 that Jesus is cognitive, that he is God, he's the creator, he's from heaven, he's going back to heaven, he's aware of all this, and with this in mind, with the God sense in him, he then strips himself of his normal clothing, he puts on the clothing of a common house servant, and then he goes forth to wash the feet of his disciples. I want us to notice this detail from verse 4 where I put the yellow letters. Jesus got up from the supper to wash the feet of the disciples. Foot washing as a normal, everyday activity in that part of the world and in that time, that it was normal, but it was practiced and would have even been practiced at this Last Supper. It was practiced when you came into the building. That's when you washed your feet, because that's when you had the dirt on your feet from walking the trails and the roads and where you ever had walked. Meaning that when the disciples reclined at the table to start the meal, their feet already would have been washed and cleaned. That would have been normal, standard operating procedure. The washing that's being talked about here that Jesus does, he does so, the meal had already started. And what this is telling us is that Jesus was washing feet that were already clean, had already been cleaned. Jesus was washing their feet not because they were dirty feet. He was washing their feet to give to them a bigger and infinitely more important lesson. Namely, that he, with his sense of who he is, God and the Creator, he was displaying for him the nature of God's kingdom, the character of God. The Lord is primarily a servant. When John tells us in his little letter, God is love, he's telling us that God is a servant. The form of God is revealed here through the washing of their feet as a servant. John then adds the commentary of Judas's betrayal at this specific point to show us what Judas was rejecting. Judas was rejecting God's character. Judas was rejecting the servantship of Jesus. He could not tolerate the idea that Jesus was not taking control of things as the king, as the creator, why he was not stomping on the throats and the heads of the enemies of God. Judas wanted a king. He wanted power. The connection between John's commentary of Judas's betrayal and this servant focus of Jesus is not accident. It's not accidental, I should say, because it happens a second time in this chapter. Starting in verse 14, it says this. Jesus is talking, if I then, the Lord and the teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example that you should also do as I did to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a slave is not greater than his master, nor is the one who is sent greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. I do not speak of all of you. I know the ones I have chosen, but it is that the scripture may be fulfilled. He who eats my bread has lifted up his heel against me. For now I am telling you before it comes to pass, so that when it does come or does occur, you may believe that I am he. Truly I say to you, he who receives whomever I send receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me. Then it comes together in verse 21. When Jesus had said this, he became troubled in spirit and testified and said, "Truly, truly, I say to you that one of you will betray me." So Jesus is talking about foot washing, and he connects it to the betrayal for the second time in this chapter. Jesus explains the reason for the foot washing. He's giving it as an example that they should continue to do for each other. As we see in the context of this, the issue is not dirty feet. The issue is service. If the Lord had not thought it beneath his own dignity to perform this service for them, why should they then think it beneath their themselves to do it for one another? And in contrast to this example of service, Jesus jumps in with the idea again of betrayal, Judas's betrayal. So the contrast really could not be greater. Judas's betrayal of Jesus was not just a general betrayal. "Oh, I don't like him, I'm going to betray him." No, it just wasn't general. Judas did this specifically because Jesus promoted himself here as a servant. Judas was rejecting Jesus' lesson of the foot washing. And if he's rejecting the lesson of the foot washing, the service he is giving here, then Judas is also rejecting the idea of Jesus going to the cross, the ultimate servantship. So through the foot washing, Jesus was exemplifying to his disciples the servant nature of our Lord. Judas's rejection of Jesus here is personal. He's rejecting the servant. He is rejecting Jesus because Jesus is not the type of God he wanted. Think about this for a moment from Judas's point of view. Judas had made this arrangement with the Jewish leaders. Matthew's gospel tells us that Jesus approached the chief priest, asking them what they would pay him to betray Jesus. Judas, who is rejecting the servant nature of Jesus, goes to the most powerful, opposite of servants, the most powerful administrators to betray Jesus. In his disappointment with Jesus, Judas could have just walked away. You know, "You're not the guy I'm looking for. I'm looking for the guy who will bring power and stomp the Romans. You're clearly not him. I'm done. I'm going away." He could have just walked away. But that's not what Judas did. He went to the most powerful people, the one group of people who could hurt Jesus, and he went and he made a deal with them so that he could betray Jesus. He did the most destructive thing possible in that circumstance. In contrast, Jesus, who had been loyal to Judas, who had been patient with Judas, who loved Judas, instead, Judas made a deal with these selfish administrators. And we see it later on in that same night when Judas placed a kiss on Jesus. Judas rejected all that Jesus had done for him. Judas turned his back on his new family. He turned his back on his team. Instead, Judas showed loyalty to a group of selfishly compromised administrators who cared nothing about him. But Judas chose power over service. It doesn't make sense, but this is what he did. John wants us to understand that foot washing was the moment that activated this power lust that sent Judas over the edge. In the most clear act of servantship, we see the most clear act of betrayal. In physical terms, Judas was angry with a house servant when he believed that that house servant should have been acting like the general of an army. It is shocking to think that someone so close, so near to Jesus, could so misunderstand Jesus. In the long run, it's probably good that Judas revealed himself. His head, his heart, his attitude was not meant for discipleship. To be precise, if Judas was not a converted man. And near the beginning of John's gospel, he wrote this. Chapter 1, verse 11, it said, "He, Jesus, came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him." Who were Jesus' own? Let's think about that for a second. At that time, it was only really the house of Judah. There were some people from the house of Benjamin. There were Levites, obviously, but they all congregated there in Judah. But for all intents and purposes, the people of God were all from the tribe of Judah at this point in time. These are the people for whom John says he came to his own. He came to Judah. Jesus, born of the house of David in Judah. He came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. Quite literally, that's true. But let's think about this from the point of view of Judas. Judas is named for the namesake Judah. Judas is simply the Greek name for Judah. Judas is symbolic of the people of God who looked at Jesus and said, "Nah, we'll take Barabbas instead." Jesus washed the feet. He washed the feet of his disciples to show the disciples how they were to treat each other. And if they were going to be leaders in God's church, leading people, caring for people, this was the attitude of humility and service that they needed to carry in their hearts each and every day. He is instilling into them the value of servant leadership. What we see from Judas is that if he had remained on Team Apostle, he would have never succeeded, because he's acting like a know-it-all, power-hungry tyrant. See, Judas had an appetite that was the same appetite that the chief priest and the Pharisees had. They all wanted power over the lives of other people. They wanted authority over people's decisions and thoughts. They did not want to serve people, they wanted to control people. After Judas left the upper room, Jesus talks more about service. In John 13, he says to them, "By this all men will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another." See, the love he showed for them was through the act of service, washing their feet. He has told them that they should do this for one another. Ultimately, he's talking about an attitude and a way to carry oneself. And he's telling this will be the way that people will know that you are my disciples, that if you have this love, you have this agape, if you have this servant love for one another. See, the kingdom of God is defined not by power. It's defined by servantship. Jesus initiated this kingdom. He died for this kingdom to show that love is seen through sacrifice and not the accumulation and the delivering of force and power. This is what we need to be continually thinking about how we build up his church. It's not about ruling and controlling lives. It's about delivering people from their sins through the sacrifice and the service of Jesus. This is the great kingdom that we have been called to be part of. It's not about ruling, it's about serving. I really thank you for listening today. I hope this will make you think and consider more how God has called us into his kingdom. Thank you.